be with you this evening. It's been a little while since I've been here. I'm not sure exactly when it was that I was here last. I did a short weekend meeting on evidences, and that's been a little while now. I've kind of lost track of time, but it's good to be back with you. I know so many of you from so many other contexts, of course, and I appreciate the invitation to be with you and begin this summer series. As we think about the fruit of the Spirit, and to talk specifically today about love, which is the first, of course, in that list that Paul gives in Galatians chapter 5. And as we think just first briefly about the fruit of the Spirit itself, I don't know how many of your speakers will give at least something of an introduction to talk about that, but I figured maybe as the first of these lessons I should at least say a word about that. Of course, the fruit of the Spirit is one of the ways that Paul contrasts between the fruit of the Spirit and the works of the flesh, contrasts a life that is lived by the values of this world and a life that is lived by the values of the next world, or as he talks about flesh and spirit very frequently as those two forces, drives that pull us in different directions. But the way that Paul talks about it here, it's not just a random list of things. By talking about it as works that one thing produces and fruit that another thing produces, what Paul is telling us that these traits that he describes here, these ideas that he talks about here, are the natural product of living according to this world's values or living according to the next world's values. It's not saying. Restart that sentence. What Paul is doing is he's giving a list of the things that just naturally flow out of the kind of life that we live. And of course, this isn't to say that it just comes easy to us or it's a natural thing that just happens immediately when you're converted, but the behaviors that he talks about should be in step with your living and with your thinking, because again, it's just the natural product of the way that you're living your life and what your goal and your focus is all about. And I would say just briefly a word, and I want to be careful about what I say and how I say it here, but I want to say briefly a word about Paul's use of the singular here when he talks about the fruit of the Spirit. Now, my point isn't to quibble about words, and anyone who ever says, makes it plural, there's something wrong with that. That's not the point, as much as it is to emphasize that there is a singularity here in the list that Paul gives. Paul's not talking about, some sort of fruit buffet where we can pick and choose the fruit that we like and skip the pineapple because, pineapple, right? Or maybe that's not what you think. Maybe it's a different fruit. But the point is, that's not what's going on here. All of this is the product of a Spirit-led life. And again, that's not to say that all of it will be equally easy to each one of us. There may be things that are more easy to you that you struggle with, or that I struggle with, or vice versa. But this is, something that should all be a part of our lives. It's certainly not a pick and choose sort of thing. Now, that said, there is certainly value in considering each element on its own to better understand each element and what Paul is talking about. And it's a valuable thing that you're doing in this summer series to think about what it's going to look like in our lives. And so again, I don't want to suggest that these are all identical things or there's some problem with thinking about them separately or anything like that. So tonight we're going to talk about love. And what I want to do is basically in two parts. First of all, I'm going to say a word about the Greek word that's used here. Now, I prefer not to focus on original languages in a church setting. I don't think it's terribly valuable. I think it, generally speaking, confuses people, confuses issues. But if there is a single Greek word that more Americans know than any other word, it's probably this one. And there are some misconceptions about this word, and I don't for a moment think that your preacher is responsible for any of those that might be here. I also don't know how frequently he talks about this and what baggage you might have brought from other places. And so since I get to say this and leave, and you can be mad at me, I'll take a moment to talk about some of the misconceptions related to the Greek word here. And then, of course, when we talk about love and Paul's understanding of love, we have to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and talk about that. And so we'll spend some time talking really primarily about the Old Testament background of this text, because that's a very important thing to understand as we get into this, and then kind of briefly run through some of the rest of what's going on there in 1 Corinthians 13. And so with that in mind, we should be done by 1 or 2 o'clock this morning, so hopefully you guys, everyone made their pit stop before you came in this afternoon. So let's talk about the word agape, the word that Paul uses in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 22 when he begins this list of the fruit of the Spirit, and talk about what is a major misconception that a lot of people have about this word. One thing that is, I'll mention in passing, just because of how I'm going to have it on the slides here in a moment, we typically talk about agape and phileo, or as we say down here, phileo, but that's actually an odd pairing because one's a noun and one's a verb. So I'll be using the noun form of each, which is agape and philia. So just so you understand why I'm doing that, I'm using the same part of speech for each of those. But what I want to talk about is what is this primary misconception about agape, which I'm calling a fallacy because it fits on the slide very well to call it that. And that is that agape is this higher, nobler Christian love. That agape is a special love. That it's a selfless, sacrificial, divine love, and philia is whatever, brotherly love, family love, nothing too special about that. It's certainly not what agape is. And so this kind of dichotomy that we've created between these two words, and one of the places where you see this quite frequently is in a lot of sermons on John chapter 21, which I'm sure you've heard one of before, that emphasizes the fact that Jesus uses one word and Peter uses the other word, and it goes back and forth. And there's this whole, subtext to the conversation based on the Greek words that they're using, when they were probably speaking Aramaic, but that's beside the point. The reason that I want to bring this up is because, again, there are misconceptions here, and the idea that a word in itself just automatically means something special all the time really isn't how language works. For the most part, words have multiple meanings that, they're all within a basic range of meaning, but they have multiple meanings, and it is context that determines meaning. The number of times that words have one meaning and only one meaning is very, very rare. And so any individual use of meaning has to come out of this full range of meaning, but is determined by context. Let me give you an imperfect example, but it's one that you'll understand, and that's the word love in English. If I say, I love pizza, and I say, I love my dog, and I say, I love my wife, would anyone for a moment think that I'm using the word love the same way in each of those three sentences? Now, obviously, there's some overlap in meaning, but they're drastically different, I hope, between I love pizza and I love my wife, right? Those don't mean the same thing. And so this is basically the idea, and the same idea applies in all languages. Agape is not a single meaning word that can only mean a higher form of love, and I'm going to demonstrate that here in just a moment. And that's the case even when it's being used in the Bible. So let me illustrate what I mean when I say this. First of all, the word agape is used negatively. If agape always means a higher, nobler, divine Christian love, it could never be used negatively, right? Well, here's a couple of times that it's used negatively. I don't know if you can read all of those citations. We'll work through this very quickly. In John chapter 3 and verse 19, Jesus talks about people who love agape, the darkness. In John 12, he talks about people who love the glory of men. In 1 John 2 and verse 15, John tells us not to love, with agape love, do not love the world or the things of the world. And Paul tells us in 2 Timothy 4 about Demas, who had agape for this present world and forsook him. Obviously not a higher, nobler love in that context. 2 Peter 2 talks about love of the wages of wickedness. Luke 11, you have the Pharisees who love the chief seats. And probably, if that's not enough, the real nail in the coffin for the idea that agape is always a higher, nobler form of love is in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, where Amnon had agape love for Tamar in 2 Samuel chapter 13. And obviously, that's not a higher, nobler love in that context. And so, first of all, it's obvious that agape is not always this higher, nobler love because it is used negatively. And then secondly, I would point out that philia is sometimes used in a more divine, quote-unquote, sense. It's used of a higher, nobler sort of love sometimes. Not as frequently, but it does appear. So, for example, God's love for Christ in John chapter 5 and verse 20. Christ's love for us in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 19. And then on top of that, it's also used of our love for Christ in John 16:27, in Matthew 10 and verse 37, and in 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 22. And in Titus 3:15, it's used of love in the faith. And all of those are words, places where, if you have this notion of agape as a special kind of love, and you read this verse, and I said, take a guess which word is used here, you'd probably not say philia or phileo. You'd say, oh, that's got to be one of those agapes. No, it's not. Because there's overlap in the range of these words and their meaning. And on top of that, sometimes agape and philia are used interchangeably. So, for example, in John 3:35 and in John 5:20, God's love for Christ, one time it's agape, one time it's philia. In John chapter 20 and verse 2 and John chapter 21 and verse 7, Jesus' love for John, one time it's agape, one time it's philia. In John 11:3 and John 11:5, just two verses apart from each other, Jesus' love for Lazarus. One time it's agape, one time it's philia. The same thing is true of the Pharisees' love for the chief seats in Luke 11:43 and Luke 20:46. And then interestingly, again, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, Proverbs 10 and verse 12, and in 1 Peter 4:8, which alludes back to that, love covering a multitude of sins. One time it's agape, one time it's philia. So obviously these words are interchangeable, at least to some degree, which again means it's not some special word all on its own. And then finally on this point, I point out the fact that agape takes modifiers. What I mean when I say it takes modifiers is descriptive words are used to tell us how to love with an agape love in the right way. Now, again, if agape is always a higher, nobler, divine Christian love, it doesn't need modifiers. It just means that. And so we're told in Romans 12:9 and 2 Corinthians 6:6 to love without hypocrisy, or love with a genuine love. And again, it's agape there. 1 Peter 1:22 to love from a pure heart. 1 Peter 4:8 to love fervently or earnestly. The multitude of times we're told to love our neighbor as ourself, rather than in a selfish way, a selfless way. Thinking about ourselves because we know how we would want to be treated. Again, it's modifying the idea. And in Luke chapter 7, in verses 42 through 47, it's a bit of a longer passage, but it talks about loving more, it talks about loving little, and it talks about loving much. And again, this is all agape, and if agape is always this higher, nobler, divine Christian love, how can you love more, or love little, or, love much, or love less, or whatever else the case may be? So, again, the point of this is to say that agape, or the verb form agapao, is not some sort of magical word that has a magical meaning, that it always means something special all the time, and that's kind of how we talk about it sometimes, at least in congregations that I've been part of. Now, to be fair, it can refer to selfless, sacrificial, nobler, higher Christian love. It absolutely can mean that. But it means that when the context demands that it means that. It means that when it has the kinds of modifiers attached to it to clarify it, that's what it means. It doesn't mean that just because that's what that word always means, because it's a special Christian word and it has no other meaning than just this, and no other word could possibly mean what this word does. And so that's the first thing I wanted to do is just spend a moment talking about this, because again, this is one of those things that circulates, and I'm sure you've heard it before. And so don't make too much of that. And those sermons you've heard before, and you'll probably hear again at some point, though not here, about John 21. It's just really not that big of a deal in terms of what Jesus and Peter are doing. Again, they're probably not even speaking in Greek in the first place. And John just loves mixing up words in the same context. He uses two different Greek words for know. He uses two different Greek words for sheep. He uses two different Greek words to talk about how to take care of the sheep. And I've never heard a sermon about any of those synonyms the way that we've heard sermons about love here in this chapter. And it's only because we have this false notion of this word being this very, very special word that only means this one thing. So that said, and that out of the way, turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and we'll spend the remainder of our time thinking about this passage, which is very well known. And there's probably not a whole lot I can say about it if you haven't heard, unless you've never picked up on the Old Testament background to this description, which is a really important part of what's going on. Now, we're not going to talk about the whole chapter. We're going to focus really on the middle, which is these qualities of this kind of love. But what's going on here is Paul's dealing with a church that is filled with pride, and they're filled with pride primarily in their spiritual gifts. And chapter 12 talks extensively about spiritual gifts, and chapter 14 talks about spiritual gifts, particularly in the context of the assembly that the Christians are sharing together. And in the middle of it is this section on love. And this happens a lot in Paul's writings, where he'll do this sandwich sort of style that begins and ends with something, and something different is stuck in the middle. Well, the part in the middle is not different. The part in the middle is a really important piece of the whole thing. And what Paul is doing is making the point that this is what matters far more than these gifts, that you're so wrapped up in it. These things that you're obsessed about, that's not nearly as important as love is. And that's the point that he makes in the first 3 verses, when he says, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have no love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, if I have faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all that I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. And then after this description, when he says, love never ends, as for prophecies they will pass away, as for tongues they will cease, as for knowledge it will pass away. It's picking up on that same idea, and then at the end, now these 3 abide, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. All of this is in the context of this boastful church's attitude about their spiritual gifts. And Paul's saying, that's not what matters. What matters is love. That's what matters. Your gifts are worthless if they're not accompanied by love, he says in the first 3 verses. And then verses 8 through 13 come back and re-emphasize the superiority of love over all of the rest. And so in the middle then, he gives this very famous description of love, the qualities of love, the traits of love, however you want to put it. But this is what Paul says. He says, love is patient and kind, or love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And of course, love never ends, which is leading back into the rest of the discussion. Well, what I would point out is that the basic descriptor, or the basic qualities that everything else grows out of in this list, is that love suffers long and love is kind. Now, there are 2 basic reasons why I think these are the 2 fundamental traits that Paul is really trying to emphasize. The first reason is that this is, in the Greek, a separate sentence that stands on its own, and all the rest of it is a separate sentence that stands on its own. And so this stands out just grammatically by itself as an introduction to all the rest of it. But beyond that, and probably a more important reason, is that these 2 traits are a prevailing description of God in the Old Testament. Turn with me to Exodus chapter 34, and we'll start there. Exodus chapter 34, in a story that actually begins back in Exodus chapter 33. Moses says to God, "Show me your glory." And God says, if I may paraphrase, yeah, I can't do that, or you're going to die. But what I will do is I'll show you my character. I'll show you who I am in the most important sort of way. And so in Exodus chapter 34, in verses 6 and 7, the Lord has taken Moses and hidden him in the cleft of the rock in this safe place. And we're told the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression of sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children's children, to the third and fourth generation. And so as God passes by, God declares his name, and God declares his character. And one of the two key parts of his character is that he is, in the translation I'm reading from, slow to anger. Now what's important to understand is two things. First, that phrase, slow to anger, when it's translated into the Greek in the Old Testament, it is the exact same word that Paul uses for love suffers long, or love is long-suffering, or love is patient, depending on the translation. The exact same word. How God describes himself is how Paul describes love. Now, this is not a singular instance where this shows up in the Old Testament. In fact, this idea of God suffering long becomes something of a refrain throughout the rest of the Old Testament. The number of times this description of God gets quoted throughout the rest of the Old Testament is pretty remarkable. The first person to quote it is Moses, and the person that he quotes it to is God. This, as a bit of a side note, is maybe a good reason why one of our pet peeves about prayer that we have from time to time needs to go out the window. I don't know if you've ever felt this way or heard somebody express this, but people who, it really bothers them when someone quotes scripture in prayer. It's like, God knows what he said. You don't have to tell God what he said. Well, yeah, that's true, but the number of people in the Bible that quote God to himself, that quote God's promises in prayer, that quote scripture in prayer, is kind of overwhelming once you see it. And Moses is the first person to quote God's statement about himself, and he quotes it to God when he's praying on behalf of the Israelites who've just rejected the promised land, and God said he's going to destroy them all in Numbers 14. What Moses reminds God of is God's character, that he's slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness. And then that's quoted again in Nehemiah's prayer, in Nehemiah chapter 9. It's also quoted in a host of Psalms, Psalm 86, twice Psalm 103, Psalm 145. It's also quoted in Joel, as Joel is talking about the people's need to repent. And it's quoted in kind of an ironic way in Jonah chapter 4. Here, Jonah is using it as an indictment against God. This is why I want to come preach here. I knew you were this way. I knew you were slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness. But again, this is God's basic character trait as God describes himself and as the people understand him from that point forward. Now, you might think that the other character trait, love suffers long and love is kind, might be in this same verse, because God is slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness. But in fact, that's not the same word this time. The word that the translators of the Old Testament used when they translated other verses is the same word that is used here by Paul. And it's a word that usually in Hebrew Bibles gets translated as good. So for example, in Psalm 34 and verse 8, the psalmist says, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." And that's the word that is translated as kind, both in the Greek translation of the Old Testament and in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Or Jeremiah chapter 33 in verses 10 and 11. "Give thanks to the Lord of hosts, for the Lord is good. His loving kindness is everlasting." Again, it's that same word for kind. Psalm 25 verses 7 and 8. "According to your loving kindness, remember me for your goodness' sake, O Lord. Good and upright is the Lord." And again, it's the same word. Psalm 86 and verse 5, "For you, Lord, are good and ready to forgive, and abundant in loving kindness to all who call upon you. And so constantly when they think about God, they think about this trait of him, that he is good or that he is kind. And in Psalm 145, 7 through 9, if you can read those tiny numbers on the screen, you'll notice that shows up on both of these. It's because both of these words appear there. They shall eagerly utter the memory of your abundant goodness, and will shout joyfully of your righteousness. The Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness. The Lord is good to all. His mercies are over all his works. And so what you find is that this basic character trait of love, or this pair of traits of love, that love is patient, or love suffers long, and love is kind, are the basic traits of God. And that really shouldn't surprise you when you stop and think about it, because God is love. That's what John tells us in 1 John chapter 4 and verses 7 and 8. And of course, that's just leading into a very lengthy description of this in that particular context. But there in those verses, beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. I mean, that by itself should tell us that when we come to understand love, we can only understand it in the context of understanding God. Love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. And anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. So of course the basic traits of love and the basic traits of God are identical. And so these two basic traits serve as not only the basic qualities of love in itself, but it also serves as something of a framework for the rest of it. To suffer long is kind of a passive sort of mentality, as love is described by what it's not, what it doesn't do in that context. And in particular, it's not focused on self. Anything that suffers long is not a self-focused sort of thing. And so other traits, like it does not envy, and it does not brag, and it does not parade itself, and it does not act unbecomingly, and it does not seek its own, and it doesn't take offense, and it doesn't keep record of wrong, and it doesn't rejoice in wickedness, all can very well fall under this basic heading of a passive, not focused on self sort of mentality. But kindness is something that is more active, and I'll come back to that in just a second. But kindness is something that's more active, and it's being described by the good that it does, not the bad that it doesn't do. And so then you would look at the traits that mirror that idea. It's described by the good it does. Focus on others. Not just a focus that's not on self, but a focus that is on others. And so it rejoices in truth. It bears and trusts and hopes and endures all things. And all those active ideas of love can fall under this heading of love being kind. And the other thing that I point out about this is that there is this very active nature in all of these traits of love. And that's manifest in the fact that all of these traits of love are described by verbs in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Paul's not talking about some conceptual trait that love either has or it doesn't have. Paul's talking about concrete actions that love does or love doesn't do. Now, English translations do varying levels of good with this in terms of translation. Sometimes they choose poorly, and sometimes there's nothing they can do because we don't have an English word that's equivalent. But the idea of love is patient is love has this conceptual trait. That's not what Paul says. Paul says love suffers long. It's an active thing that love does. Love is not arrogant, some translations say. Well, again, here is a conceptual trait that love doesn't have. That's not what Paul said. Paul says love boasts not. Again, it's the action that love doesn't do in this case. Love is not irritable. No, love provokes not. Love is not resentful. No, love does not count the evil or something along those lines is more literally what it says. The idea is love doesn't keep record of all of the wrongs that someone else has done against you. Yeah, that could be described as not being resentful, but again, it's not just this conceptual thing that you have or you don't have. It's what are you actually doing in your life? And what are you not doing in your life? That's what Paul's talking about through this entire section. Now again, there are other places where it's just hard to know what to do. Love is kind. Well, that's a verb in Greek, the word kind. We don't have a verb for kind in English. Love kinds. Love kindifies. I mean, I don't know what to do with that to make it work. And so there are places that the translators can only do what they can do. But even that is not a concept that love happens to have. It is active. It's the act of kindness that people do to each other that, again, is exemplified in what God has done and how God has done it. And that's going to be the case of all of this, all the way through, point by point. And we could talk about, each one of these elements in a lot of detail or in a little detail, but what we're going to come back to over and over again is you want to know what this looks like. Go look at God and how God has done it. And again, it's not does God have it, it's how God has done it. And that becomes the standard for how we do all of these things too. And as I heard Tom Hamilton, who is speaking in this series later this summer, say as he was talking about this text relatively recently, he says there's a really great test that any one of us can run on ourselves to see how well we're living in line with this. And the test goes something like this. I'll do it for me, you can do it for you. Nathan is patient and is kind. Nathan does not envy or boast. Nathan is not arrogant. Nathan is not rude. He does not insist on his own way. He is not irritable or resentful, and on down the line we go. And if you're anything like me, it doesn't take very long into that list before you start feeling terribly inadequate. It is just an incredible litmus test that we can all put ourselves to the test on at any point. See how well we are living up to this. And that's a really important piece of this that we'll come to in just a moment as well, is that we really should be living up to this. This should not just be, a very famous passage that, we read at weddings or we cross-stitch and hang on the wall or whatever. But this is something that is fundamental to who we are. But before that, I do want to come back to this last thing that, like I said, is really transitioning out of the description of love and back into the superiority of love in the context of what he's doing, and that is that love never fails or love never ends. And in context, he's emphasizing the permanence of love in contrast with the transitory spiritual gifts that they're so obsessed with. And he's going to ultimately come back and emphasize how great love is by talking about things that are even greater than these spiritual gifts, things like faith and hope. I mean, you want to talk about biblical ideas that are extremely important. Faith and hope are being high on that list, right? If we just were to do, let's do some brainstorming and talk about some of the most important biblical concepts that we could come up with. Love would be on the list, of course. Faith would be on the list, absolutely. Somewhere along the lines, depending on who you are and how you think about things, hope would come up at some point. But my guess is we wouldn't get too many top 10 lists that don't have faith and hope on them. We'd probably, and most people who wear the name Christian, whether or not we agree with all their doctrines, most people wouldn't have speaking in tongues and prophesying those things in their top 10. Yet faith and hope, that's really important stuff. And so in addition to contrasting love with the spiritual gifts that Paul's trying to put in their proper context, he comes back and says, again, so now faith, hope, and love abide these three, but the greatest of these is love. And of course, what makes love the greatest is, again, its permanence. Because there will come a day where faith will be replaced by sight. We will no longer believe that God is. We will know that God is, because we will see him as he is and we will be made like him, as John says. There will be no need for faith anymore. And there will come a day where our hope will be realized. And we will no longer hope for things. We will have experienced those things, and we will possess those things. And so even great ideas like faith and hope are transient ideas that are destined to go away with time. But love is what will endure eternally. And when you look at what I've got on the slide, what is love? Well, it's what God does. It's what God is. And so is it any surprise then to realize that also love never fails, love will never end? Well, we're back to what God is yet again. The timeless, eternal nature of God is the timeless, eternal nature of love. And what Jesus says on a couple of occasions is that this basic trait of God should also be the basic trait of Christians. You know, the reason why it's important to read 1 Corinthians 13 with your name in there and to feel how inadequate you are and to strive to be better is because love is what should characterize our lives as Christians. And you can see that in at least a couple of different ways in Jesus' teaching. Of course, there is this discussion of the greatest commandment. What is the greatest commandment? Someone asked Jesus one day. He said, well, you tell me what you think. And of course, then there's the conversation that ensues, but ultimately what Jesus says is that it is to love God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And I don't think that those are two different things. Sometimes we talk about them as the two greatest commandments, but what the rest of the Bible makes very clear is you can never have one without the other. They're two sides of the same coin. If you don't love your fellow man, you don't love God, John says. And if you do love God, you will love your fellow man. Paul, when he, on two different occasions, says, this is the greatest commandment that everything else hangs on, he says it's love your neighbor as yourself. He doesn't list both parts. And it's not that he's arguing with Jesus. It's that you can't have the one without the other. And so love is fundamental to our Christian lives because it is the essence of what it means to follow God. It is the greatest commandment. Sometimes manifest, always manifest in our love for God, and sometimes and always manifest in our love for our fellow man. But then also Jesus tells his disciples in John chapter 13, by this all men will know that you are my disciples, because you have love for each other. It's the distinguishing mark of Christians is their love for each other. I don't know about you, but I've heard several sermons over the course of my life. There are sermons about what makes us different. A lot of sermons I've heard about what makes us different are sermons about we don't use instrumental music, and we take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week, and we've got a scripturally authorized name on our sign, and we do this, and we do that, and we do the other. And I don't want to minimize the importance of being doctrinally correct. I don't want to minimize the importance of doing what God tells us to do. But I don't know that I've ever heard one of those sermons that quotes Jesus when he says, this is what makes me different. This is what makes the world know that you are one of my disciples. If you love one another. Well, why is that so important? Well, that's so important because that's buried in the family likeness. If we are God's sons, we should look like God's sons. If we are God's daughters, we should look like God's daughters. We should bear the divine image. The divine image is first and foremost love. People will know that we're God's people if we're loving because that means we look like God when we are loving. We are being his followers and looking like him. And so the question that I always ask myself as I think about this idea, by this all men will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. What would someone notice if they came in our midst on a Sunday and spent a couple of hours with us? Not just what would they notice. They notice things. But what would they walk away thinking? I mean, if they'd only been in cathedrals, they would notice that this is a pretty plain building. If they'd only been in places where there are choirs or praise bands, they would notice a difference in our singing. If they went to a place that only took the Lord's Supper on Christmas and Easter, they'd notice that here we are taking it, beginning of June or whatever. They'd notice those things. It's impossible not to notice those things. But what do they walk away as the thing that most impacted them? If someone comes and let's say they get here 15 minutes early and they spend a good 15 minutes actually talking to me and they hang out, and between your Bible class and your sermon, they talk a little bit more with some people, get to know some people a little bit better. And they listen through the whole sermon, and they stay for your study session after your sermon and kind of experience that, and then hang out for another 15, 20 minutes afterward, talking to everybody else after that. And then they leave. What do they walk away thinking? Do they walk away thinking, well, that's weird, they didn't use a piano? Or do they walk away thinking, that's the most loving group of people I've ever been around? It is obvious in how they talk to each other. It's obvious in how they care for each other. It's obvious in the way they frame their questions and their discussion points. It's obvious that they love each other. And you know what? If I didn't know better, I'd think they love me, and I've never been here before. That is the most loving group of people I've ever been around in my life. They walk away thinking after they spend time with us. I tell you, if they walk away thinking we're loving people, they walk away thinking we're God's people. If they walk away thinking that's strange, they didn't have a piano, they walk away thinking, well, that's just another weird denomination. You know what? If someone comes and spends 2.5 hours with us, and spends 45 minutes talking to us in their personal reaction, and spends that much time around us, and all they get out of their time with us is that's weird, they don't have a piano, you know what, they might just be right. We're nothing but another weird denomination. If we don't show God's love in how we treat each other and how we treat everyone around us, we're not bearing the mark that Jesus names as what makes us different. That's a challenge for all of us. A challenge for all of us in the world, in our interactions with people in the world. It's a challenge for us as visitors come in our midst. That is what Jesus holds up as what makes us different. That's what Jesus holds up as the greatest command on which all other commands hang. And that is the case because love is not just something. Love is the basic character of God that we are trying to emulate in our own lives. Well, if you take your songbooks and turn to number 300, is it? Is that right? 300. We'll sing this as a song of invitation and encouragement as we reflect on our lives and as we reflect on the call to be like God. And to be sure, none of us live up to that call perfectly, and there are always ways that we can make ourselves better. But if you need to begin your life with God, or if there's some way that we can help you